Welcome, everyone, to the Pick Six podcast, where we discuss the biggest stories in college football. I'm your host, Chris Chang, and joining me as always is my co host, Rudy Tamarchio. Rudy, we know that the weakest link on the Hurricanes was the defensive backs and safeties, but it looks like Miami may have found a secondary solution in Zach Etheridge coming from Houston, where he did two stints. And in between those two stints, he was at Auburn. He played as a safety at Auburn, and he is expected to coach the DBs. No word on whether he'll coach the safeties as well. He played safeties, is why I include that in there. Now, this seemed to be a kind of below the radar kind of hire. What do you think drove Mario to hire him?
I mean, Mario always flies under the radar, but in terms of him, I think it's just in terms of who he's helped produce and what the production numbers of those safety units were, those secondary units were. Because in this case, like, yeah, everyone's looking for that really sexy hire. Everyone wants to see like the
Yep.
guy that the name everyone knows, where they come from. And look, you can have a few of those people on your staff, but what's that payroll going to look like if you have an all-star at every single position coach level?
That's
It's
true.
not going to be sustainable. And also, you're probably not going to keep guys for too long in that way. I think in this case, it's like, is he the answer long term? I don't know. Given his, kind of like given his travels throughout college football, he doesn't really seem to stay in one place for too
Yeah.
long. But at this point, nobody stays in college football for too long anymore in terms of talent, in terms of coaches. If you could just turn around in 1 year, that's a nice little, piece to hang your hat on. And if you go somewhere else after that, good for him. If not, we'll happily keep him for a long time. Anybody who is an assistant coach somewhere and you hear their fan base say, I wish we didn't lose that guy, that's someone I want. And he
Yeah.
fits the bill there.
And it's wild because there's a little bit of nepotism, but he just had gotten a promotion at Houston. Fun fact, his father-in-law is the head coach at Houston. So that's why he's done two stints there. And in between he went to Auburn, which makes sense because that's his alma mater. But at Houston ranked third in the Big 12 and 22nd nationally in passing yards allowed against FBS opponents. Just to kind of give you, what is that in relation to Miami? I think Miami was in like the high 60s. I think 67 is where we ranked last year. No surprise, water is wet. As Auburn's defensive backs coach in the 2023 season, Etheridge led the unit to the third best secondary in the SEC with passing yards allowed. So he's kind of got some consistency in that. There are approximately 20 blue chip signees where Etheridge is credited as the primary recruiter for 24. That's from 24/7 Sports. Now, I've always believed, and we've stressed it on this show, that the talent is going to follow the coaching. So now we know recruiting is crucial to Mario's staff and being on Mario's staff and to the health of a program, which is what I just alluded to. How do you think Etheridge is going to do with recruiting?
Well, there is one guy that's supposed to be, at Houston that he entered the transfer portal. I forget his name, but there was one defensive back that was entering the portal, then stayed.
Right.
That was before all of this, movement happened. So I'm wondering if he might join and come to Miami as well. Because look,
Are you
Miami has
talking about the
nailed.
DB from Auburn?
I
There was a
was it
DB
Auburn or was
from
it one from Houston?
there was a DB that he recruited at Auburn, then followed him to Houston last season, and so I'm not sure if that's the same guy you're talking about.
Think that's the same guy.
It probably it sounds like it tracks.
Yeah, that all tracks. So I wonder if he would then come to Miami too, which granted, Miami's made some great signings in the offseason in terms of the secondary with guys like Zechariah Poyser. And look, we don't officially have Xavier Lucas left yet, but we all know where that's going.
Right.
So there's a lot of great signings that's come through this. I wouldn't be surprised there in terms of recruiting from like the high school level. I believe he has some ties to South Florida, which is good. I just think it's look, as much as to have your staff that specialize in South Florida, you can't have everybody specialize in South Florida.
Right.
So
Well,
if
it's funny you mentioned that. I was reading an article, I think it was in Kane's Insight, was saying that he actually has a really good presence in Alabama and Georgia, where again, you have great talent. Obviously Alabama recruits in state and Georgia recruits in state. And then nationally, a lot of programs will recruit in those two states where you have studs. So I think that may be more of his kind of speciality. I mean, if you're, I feel like kids in Florida understand what talented coaches are and what good coaches are. So if you're a good coach, you can naturally recruit. But it's always nice if you already have a footprint in another state to be able to open those doors for the program.
Yeah, I mean, look, your bread and butter has to come from South Florida if you're
Yeah.
Miami. If you can pick the best at any position, that's regardless of where they're from in the country, that's what you have to do. That's your formula for success. Doesn't really change. Like, even though the sport has kind of evolved a little bit, that formula still rings true. So if you did the old traditional state of Miami, fence off the entire south of I-4 kind
Four
of
quarter, yeah.
corridor, and then go find the rest of your guys. Like when you find DJ Williams from De La Salle, that's not hard to go find and do. You get Ed Reed from Destrehan in Louisiana. Like, you
Yeah.
find the guys.
Oh,
So
absolutely. And they could be anywhere, and so far the Hurricanes have signed 4 of the top 20 secondary players acquired in this winter's portal. We have another portal, spring portal, opening up in a few months. Miami has signed 3 cornerbacks in the class of 2025 for the upcoming season and has a commitment from legacy Camden Portis to add to the room in 2026. The top-rated signees whom Etheridge is credited with being signing are as a primary recruiter is 4-star defensive lineman Keldrick Folk at Auburn. So, I mean, this guy does have a history of signing some guys. I think they were saying that he's signed about, I think, either like 3 to 6 draftees in the last 3 to 4 years, mainly during his time at Auburn. But I mean, we're gonna have to see. I see a lot of positive when looking this up because he kind of was a name, like we were alluding to at the beginning of the episode, kind of flew under the radar. I'm seeing a lot of positive coverage on Etheridge. Do you think this is legit and warranted, or should we be a little apprehensive because it could be a little homer coverage?
I mean, it's probably a mixture of both, right? Anybody that you bring in, you're going to have some sense of homer coverage. Like, I think of it's partially, yeah, there's some homer coverage, but also it's seeing where his track record is more than beyond the previous year. Or
Right.
if he's only been at one place for like a year, where do you go from there? Like, I think the biggest example, if you go back in like the history books of Miami coaching assistant announcements that were like considered a really big deal, we signed as our defensive backs coach back in like 2004 or 2003 was Tim Walton. They brought him over from LSU. And I remember thinking like, oh, okay, great. That's kind of a continuity of a really strong position group, because before that was none other than Mark Stoops was our
Right.
defensive backs coach in 2002. So they're like, they already had, I think, 2 or 3 corners go to the NFL out of LSU like the year before. I go, oh, that's amazing. And then you realize that Tim Walton was there for 1 year. And all of that development doesn't happen in one calendar year. So
Yeah.
uh, Miami still had great talent. Like, I'm not going to call out Tim Walton and say that he was an absolute failure as a defensive backs coach, because if you look at what those defensive backs were that he was working with, we'd still look back and say those guys are studs. Guys like
Oh,
Antro
compared to today,
Rowland,
yeah.
Kelly Jennings, Marcus Maxey, like
Yeah.
the name goes. It was a pretty good couple of years. It just wasn't quite at the level of. In this case, it wasn't even really coaching, because how are you going
Right.
to replace a guy like Sean Taylor or Ed Reed
Exact.
or Mike
Well,
Rumpf, who's now on the staff, Philip Buchanan, who was one of the fastest defensive backs in the NFL in his day. So I think it's everything is promising, but what I like is that we don't have like this overabundance of saying, oh, he's going to turn everything around. It takes 2 to tango. The coach does his job. You need to have the talent there too. And clearly, what we had last year was kind of the worst case scenario, where the scheme wasn't really matching. And we don't know what the scheme was so bad that you really didn't know for most of the year, is it personnel or is it not personnel? Like,
right.
the only time we really looked successful was when we actually brought additional safeties down to defensive back, partially because of injuries, but partially because they were the most experienced guys. So
Yeah.
I guess to go back and saying, like, in Lance Skidry's defense, I guess Chevis Jackson was the defensive backs coach for cornerbacks, and Lance Skidry was coaching the safeties. So if you tell me that the best coach guys outside of like OJ Frederica corner were the safeties, that's kind of an indictment on your previous defensive backs coach that you thought you were hitting a home run with last year. So
Right, and I think the one thing I do like about this hire is it's not someone that's tied to the new defensive coordinator, which is what we kind of did with Guidry when we brought Chevis from I think it was from Marshall, right? He
yep.
coached, yeah. So when we brought him from Marshall, so there's kind of going to be a little bit of newness. So it can kind of work not in your favor as well because it's going to be the first time these guys are working together. But I also think there might not be that cronyism, and Miami has not had a good history of cronyism when it comes to coaches, especially on the defensive side. So I think that's the one positive light. My only apprehension with Etheridge is, like you were saying, he has kind of bounced around, and there is this buzz and this underlying kind of like reporting going around that he kind of is a guy who is expected to kind of up and leave. I think he was up for the Louisiana Monroe job a few years back. So my only concern is with bringing the talent that we're bringing in this year, who I think there's only one person, the guy from Michigan State, who has 1 year of eligibility left. The rest of the talent we're bringing in has at least 2 years of eligibility. So I'd really like to see this guy hopefully stay for at least 2 years minimum. My hope is that it's not a one and done, but that would be my only apprehension when it comes to Etheridge.
In his defense, since he left Auburn, I mean, he played there. He won a national championship there with Cam Newton.
Right,
Hugh
in
Freeze is
2010, yeah.
also the Hugh Freeze is also the coach at Auburn.
Well, I think that's why he left. I think
I
when Hugh
would
Fre
I wouldn't stay.
yeah.
I would leave. I wouldn't tell anyone. I'd just disappear.
Yeah. 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 And I think, and that's the thing, other thing too, like just because people leave doesn't mean it's because they were inept or they weren't up to par. Sometimes it's better moves. It's a disagreement with staff. I mean, you just saw the defensive coordinator from Ohio State who just won a national championship go over to their conference rival in Penn State. You know what I mean? Which is, I mean, they're going to say it's a family reason, but I mean, we all know there was probably some friction in there. There's been reporting there was friction in that locker room between the defensive line coach and the defensive coordinator. So anything can happen. We don't know. There's politics involved in everything, but my hope is that Etheridge can come in, lay his footprint down, get the secondary turned around, and get again the main thing. If anything, I want to work on is communication. Right, make sure we're all clear on our communication and the coverage because I feel like it's not even so much the talent in terms of the physical. I feel like it's a mental talent thing where it's like, can you adjust to coverage? Can you adjust to audibles? And can you communicate effectively with your teammates? So we shall see. Anyways, reports of the ACC's demise seem to have been greatly exaggerated as ESPN makes a long expected move in exercising the option in its agreement with the league. The network's extension takes the contract currently expiring in 2027 to 2036. The deal remains mostly unchanged. There's no increase in money and no change in the structure of payment. This was a kind of a one-sided affair. While the ACC presidents did meet this past Wednesday to ratify this, it was basically like they couldn't do too much. They kind of had to take what they could get. ESPN held the leverage in this, and it was up to them or not to whether they wanted to renew. And as part of the agreement, the league's biggest brands, Florida State, Miami, and Clemson, are expected to play more football games regularly, with Notre Dame, who is a partial member when it comes to the football side of it. They are a full member in other sports. The Irish are expected to play at the very least two out of those three teams every season in a rotation every year. The ACC is also expected to schedule more attractive and competitive games to make their brand a little bit more rich. ESPN and the ACC both hope that the extension will facilitate a road to settlement with Clemson and Florida State, who are currently locked in litigation with the conference. Rudy, did you expect this? Did you see this coming, or is this kind of a surprise for you?
This is 100% what was going to happen the whole time. I mean, you look at where would the ACC go if they didn't have that ESPN deal? They would
Right.
it would be another group. It would be called the Group of Six at that point. Because the ACC is going to be in there, and they would probably lose all their leverage with the team. So, like, I don't think there
Oh
was
yeah.
ever a chance. Because look, ESPN's not going to give that opportunity either. Like, it's one of those things where, like, is ESPN worse off if they had dropped the ACC? No,
Oh,
but
absolutely not.
it's more valuable for them to say, look at all the college football we have. We have
Right.
the top echelon. We have the circle of suck. It's like it's like the telenovela.
Yeah.
You have that piece over there too. It's like you have every base covered for different strokes for different folks, and they've got a whole big circle of suck here in the ACC to go through. It's entertaining nonetheless. I mean, if you look at regardless of like the biggest marquee matchups that are out there in other conferences for college football, the ACC does pretty good in viewership for having some weird circus games, Miami
Yeah.
being the beneficiary of that last year. Like, how many of us stayed up all night freaking out watching that Cal game? And that game actually got some pretty good visibility and viewership out of it.
Oh, it
So
was I mean, here's the one thing I will say. And this is not a homer. This is, I mean, people will tell you this. And then this is a quote that I hear all over ESPN and almost every pundit. It's like college football does better when Miami is good, right? And when we are rocking and rolling, we are a team to watch. People like to watch us either to hate us or to cheer for us. And it's as simple as that. And I think the Cal game was one of those great examples where you got to see an electrifying offense a struggling defense keep Cal in the game, and then for us to come back in those late hours. Not only that, but then you had the factor of Cal hosting game day for the first time. There's a little novelty in that. So the ACC, there are little things here and there that I think make it attractive. I wonder, Rudy, does this mean the ACC is alive and well? That like ESPN, because we kind of knew this was going to happen, or is this a band aid slash a life support line, and something else needs to be worked out?
They're kicking the can down the road. It's
Yeah,
one of those things where it's not going to help. It's not going to be like Clemson and Florida State have nowhere to go. Let's just be honest with you. Like
yeah,
they have nowhere to go. Their stock has dropped since they filed their suits. They needed to get out while they had momentum on their side because, frankly, there's to take like an outside reference from other sports. Look at like Formula One, for example.
hmm,
Every time a new team is introduced, if they get approved to add a new team, so they're adding like an 11th team this year with General Motors and Cadillac, they're starting in 2026. They had to pay Formula One $200 million to get in because they had to make up for whatever amount of media money was going to be lost by adding an 11th team. So they had to
yeah,
put up that much money to make everybody happy so that nobody loses any money out of cutting that slice of the pie so many times. Eventually, that's what these conferences are going to do too. So the SEC is going to say, sure, Florida State, do you want to come join our conference? It's going to cost you $400 million because
yeah,
we're already paying each school this much. They're not taking any less. So you got to pony up. And if you're Florida State, you're already hemorrhaging money on lawyers with this
oh
ongoing
yeah,
lawsuit. They have extended discovery until like March of 2024, likely because they're going to make sorry 2025.
2025, yeah,
What year are we in? Holy
yeah,
crap! Um, they're gonna extend discovery because they're likely going to settle before that
oh,
happens.
absolutely, yeah,
They're renovating their stadium to make it nicer. And because they're renovating their stadium, that means they also don't have the attendance numbers that they normally do. They also don't have the attendance numbers they normally do because they were 2-10 last year. So like it's just these compounding cuts and injuries to say, where are you going to go? Because
yeah,
nobody wants you in your current state. Go back, work on yourself a little bit, take some yoga, go to the gym, come back to Florida State the way that you were, and maybe give it a try in a couple of years from now because that buyout gets smaller as the years go on in the deal. But to be honest with you, like Chris, we talked about this in terms of like what college football looks like and how these mega conferences are working. There's a couple of winners and there's a whole lot of losers.
yeah,
You have like for every Oregon that was successful in terms of jumping conferences and being part of the Super League in the Big Ten, there's Washington, there's USC, there's UCLA who all
yep.
suffered out of it.
Right. I mean,
So
let's look at the SEC too. You had Texas, stellar, Oklahoma tanked, right?
yeah,
And you even look at the two other schools that jumped the Big 12 10 years ago now, I think it's been, in Mizzou and Texas A&M. What success have they seen? Neither of those teams, I don't think either of those teams have ever made it to Atlanta and played for an SEC championship.
Colorado left and came back.
Yeah, I feel like UCLA and USC are going to quickly figure that out too. They're going to take a page out of Colorado's book and they're going to be like,
And
"Yeah, we
Nebraska
had a little
too.
buyer's remorse. We're going to go back and try and get this pack thing alive."
Yeah, and Nebraska too. They left the Big 12 for the Big 10 and Nebraska wasn't Nebraska when they left.
No, and I think
And
one of the
John
biggest mistakes that, like, again, to me, eh, and we're going to discuss this in an episode of How to Fix College Football. You got to get back to understanding there are brands and your conferences are, this isn't 1990, right? When everyone had to jump into a conference and that was kind of like your thing. Like we're now getting to a point and we're getting to an era in college football, I feel like, where the brand is actually bigger than the conference. It's kind of like the Jeremiah Smith argument, right? Like Jeremiah Smith right now, like we know he's going to stay at Ohio State, but Jeremiah Smith could go to, like I joked last week, can go to Appalachian State and still be a first rounder. Like that's going to, like, he's just a generational talent. It's not going to change. Alabama can literally go to the AAC. They're not going to lose a dime. Trust me. Between that booster base, the eyes they draw, like it's a brand. Like Bama, you could put Bama in the pack two, the two pack. You know what I mean? And they're
Yep.
still go. And not only will they dominate, but they're going to people. I guarantee you, a company, whether it be Apple, someone is going to pick up and ask to do some sort of grant of rights for them if they were to ever leave the SEC. I don't think it will. But with that said, it actually makes me wonder, as all of this kind of comes through and people restructure the revenue distribution, because I think Clemson and FSU are going to stay, because I don't think the SEC or the Big Ten want them, not because they don't want their brands, but I think the smaller schools who kind of know that, like, should they allow FSU and Clemson in, it's going to be a smaller cut for them. And then it's only a matter of time before the SEC and the Big Ten do what the ACC is proposing, which is this whole restructuring of the distribution where it's kind of a pay for play, pay for based on success and eyes drawn. And I think that will maybe keep FSU and Clemson at bay. Do you think the thing that they were discussing in September, where they were going to redistribute the funds, are going to keep FSU at bay, that on top of this extension? Or do you still think that FSU and Clemson are still going to try and find a way out?
They have a lot of work to do to take advantage of these new, rules that they're trying to work for. Because when they were first advocating for those, FSU was 13-0.
Yep.
They go 2-10, and I think, like, yeah, their first couple of games are very highly watched because everyone wanted to watch the dumpster fire.
Yeah.
Everyone wanted to see, the heavens fall and say, "Oh, wait, are they going to lose another game?" And by week 4, they go, "Well, we don't need to see this anymore. We know what's happening."
Right.
So if again, everything is cyclical, so it's not nothing to say that maybe FSU reloads in the portal and they get to 8 wins this year or something like that. Will they have compelling matchups? Maybe. I mean, outside of that one Notre Dame game, like, is Notre Dame going to be the stimulus that gets them to go? Because remember, that deal only works if Notre Dame comes to their house, because that's when it's going to be on ESPN Air. If you go to South Bend, you're playing on NBC. You're playing
Right.
on Notre Dame's $50 million a year deal with them, with NBC Sports. So you can't really depend on that game at all times. So they have to get better. For that to work, they have to get better. And for the other piece about, all the incentives, where if you make it to the conference championship game, if you're ranked in the top 25, we talked about all that. The ACC has zero respect there either.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 teams finish ranked in the top 25. Maybe 2 teams make the college football playoff, even when it's expanded to 12 teams. So that's on the ACC, frankly, because they need to make this conference no longer a joke when it comes to officiating. I mean, look, you watched a couple of those bowl games and those college football playoff games, and the lack of, like, pass interference and stuff being called. They go,
Right.
"Oh, that's got to be an ACC crew." Look it up.
Sure
Lo and
enough.
behold, ACC crew.
Yeah.
Imagine that. So until that stuff changes, you're kind of in the same boat. They just have more excuses to pull from.
Yeah. I think the ACC, I think the Clemson and FSU lawsuits, while as asinine as I think they are actually beneficial. And here's why. I think it kind of put a fire under these smaller programs and these fledgling programs that probably didn't take football so seriously, your BCs, your UNCs, to kind of bring in some big name coaches so that they can maybe improve their ranks. I'm not saying these teams are going, or these programs are going to be contenders whatsoever in the next couple of years. But again, what I was just alluding to when I was talking about brands, I think that's the era of college football we're going into. We're going into branding. What is your brand? What's your name recognition? How do people recognize you? What's your logo? How powerful is your logo in the grand scheme of things? I think the SEC and the Big Ten are brands in themselves, but I think we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see, especially if Clemson and Florida State do see a benefit in this restructured revenue system in the ACC, how long is Bama and Georgia going to allow Vanderbilt to make the same money as them? How
100%.
long is Michigan and Ohio State going to allow Indy and Purdue to make as much money as them? Not long. Not long.
And how long are they going to allow the conference to negotiate on their behalf when it comes to, like, media negotiations and deals? So, like, something we've been
Exactly.
talking about for a few weeks now is, like, docuseries. And, like, you know all about my trials and tribulations of trying to get to Miami and saying Miami as a brand standing alone is a more compelling story than an SEC or a Big Ten in terms of selling the production rights to a docuseries to, like, a box to box productions, or $7 Productions with Dwayne the Rock Johnson, who's a Miami football alum of all people.
Yep.
Uh, there's just why the SEC gets this deal with the same company that does Formula One's Drive to Survive. That's going to be on Netflix. people don't care to watch like, oh, here's what's going on in the SEC this week with this team, and then they go to this team. Like they want to follow one continuous story all the way across.
Yep.
So as long as they let the conferences negotiate on their behalf, that's never going to happen because it's going to be an SEC podcast docu series. It's not an Alabama docu series. It's not a Tennessee docu series. They're not going to do that. They're never going to be able to play preferences. So yeah, you're right. Just like how it's NIL for athletes in terms of what they're doing with their own individual brands, these schools are individual brands too. So they should be finding every loophole they have in their current grant of rights, in their current media partnerships and structures to say, where can we go after ourselves and grab some money for what we're doing? Can we go on Twitch and do like our pregame shows from there and have like a live stream with all these different people? Can we do our own docu-series with Hulu or Apple TV or something? Because at the moment, yeah, there's ACC Network, but ACC Network's not putting out a docu-series.
And
They're not.
let's face it, the ACC, the ACC, yeah, all of them. I mean, I'll be Big Ten Network, SEC Network on ESPN. They're all jokes. No one watches them. No one goes there. Those are literally homes for when Purdue plays, I don't know, Middle Tennessee. Like, it's not for the big games. The marquee games, the game, the Oregon versus Penn State, like those are always going to be on ABC or ESPN. You'll never find those on the Big Ten Network or Fox. That's or yeah, you will find on Fox, but like Fox Sports. You know what I mean? Like you're never going to see that on the secondary channels. Those are, I feel like those are kind of just like, hey, like here you go, guys. Like take this. I hope you guys are happy with this. Here's a little extra money to give you guys some credibility. Which realistically, I think that's actually a bygone like gesture that just stems from the Longhorn Network. So,
Yeah.
if you go back in history, the SEC network, the Big Ten, now the ACC, all of those stem from when um Texas got their deal with ESPN for the Longhorn Network, which is also obsolete and completely useless. No one watches that in comparison to ESPN. So I think if ESPN's smart, they cut all these stupid networks, get that money back, put it in the ACC. Because here's my question: how does this play out if there is a power shift in college football? So we saw this year the SEC's grip over college football slip a little bit. 2 years in a row, the Big Ten wins, but we've seen that the Big Ten can bleed and they are vulnerable. What are the chances and how does it play out if there is a shift in college football, Rudy?
How does it play out? I
Yeah.
mean, we almost saw that this year because we talked about this before the show. If Notre Dame were to win the national championship, if they had beaten Ohio State, for those of us who don't like Notre Dame, that could have been a pretty dangerous precedent that was being set because now you're showing a team that necessarily doesn't need to have the strongest schedule go through. And what we learned after the first year of an expanded playoff is you don't need to have the first round bye. If anything, because you have young kids playing for you, they need the extra time to play and stay hot. So you want to host your first round playoff game at your own home. So what does it do for college football? If these trends continue, and believe me, they're paying attention, it kind of ruins everything that they were expecting this to be. Oh, we have to schedule really tough games every single year. So that way, if you have 2 or 3 losses, you might still get in. Doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things because you could have one of the softer schedules and still go out there and play. I mean, look, Northern Illinois might as well be anointing themselves national champions because they're the only ones that beat Notre Dame this year.
Yeah.
And well, after after Ohio State, so they finished second. It's like, cool, Northern Illinois, we're number three. The
Well, I
Huskies.
mean, technically, I mean, if you really think about it, Michigan, they could be back-to-back winners because they beat Ohio State.
Exactly. So, like, that super hard schedule doesn't mean what I guess everyone thought it was supposed to mean.
Yeah.
It only really works in the world of like Notre Dame. Well, no, it doesn't even work for Notre Dame because like they have to schedule soft because even if they do have, let's say they have a really hard schedule and they would play like Miami, Clemson, Ohio State, Michigan, uh, let's USC. Like, let's say they have like this gauntlet of a schedule for 12 games. They
Right.
go 500, they're not getting a bid for the college football playoff. They're only getting in because they're the highest ranked non-conference affiliate independent that, had only one loss. That's why they
Well,
get
I
it.
think the stipulation is even still with Notre Dame is they have to finish in the top 12.
Yep.
So like they can still get in, but they have to finish in the top 12 no matter what. It's not like if they're in the top 25 they still get in. They have to finish in the top 12 to get a berth.
Yep. So like in that way, it's like if the shift happens, I mean, the one thing that's kind of concerning if you're one of these big conferences is that you're not necessarily too big to fail, but like we talked about this in terms of buyer's remorse. When some of your big names start leaving again because they realized, ooh, once you kind of get in that rut of having losing seasons, how do you climb your way back? Alabama took a long time to come back from where they were in the doldrums. In terms
Yeah.
of some of the other teams, Tennessee is still not quite back to what it was when Peyton Manning was around. Florida is nowhere near coming back from those Urban Meyer years yet.
Yeah.
So when that fall happens, it's painful. They're kind of on the outside looking in. That's where we go back to our whole like the diversity of having these different conferences is that you don't need to bet on that every single year. Yeah, you're getting this flat fee from your conference every single year, but the best programs are going to find ways that they're getting more money that's not hinged on the wins and losses, that's more on the strength of their brand. That's where the long-term success is.
Well, that's why I was alluding to a power shift in college football because like I said, we've seen this decade and a half maybe of dominance by the SEC, and if you want to kind of argue maybe the Big 10, I don't think so. I think the Big 10's I don't know where this idea that the Big 10 is this superior conference in the sense that like Michigan's won, Ohio State's won. Ohio State has been competitive in the playoff, but it's taken them 10 years to win a championship. So it's not like you had a Clemson situation where it was like, oh, Clemson, Bama, right? So the only conference that can outright say they were dominant was the SEC. And even then, you really got to get into the minutia of it. And it's really Bama that was dominant. It really wasn't the entire SEC because it wasn't like Auburn was playing for a championship every year. It wasn't like LSU was playing for a championship every year. And the championship that LSU did win was a freaking fluke that everyone is just like, I don't know how a two loss team got in here, but they did. So you're seeing now that teams are getting gutted in terms of their depth. There's way more parity across the board. When these contracts go up in about 5 or 6 years in 2031, I believe the ACC's is 2036, but I believe the SEC and the Big Ten are like 2031 and 2033 or something like that. It's those 2 years. Something tells me that if the ACC can still be, because this was my next question, I want you to think about this while I go into this little tangent. What's the future of the ACC and grant of rights? Um, if the ACC can become a little bit more competitive, there's only so much money that can go around, right? And why would you pay SEC the top dollars if they're not dominant anymore? And especially if you look at it from the ESPN's perspective, in the sense that ESPN, for lack of better terms, owns the ACC. Why would they let their investment go to hell? Right? No, they want both of their ships to rise. What is it? High tide raises all ships,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Rising tide lifts all boats. Yeah.
Right. So it's like, think about it, right? If you're making right now, because literally they're paying pennies on the dollar for the ACC. I mean, there's no way. And when everyone was like, oh, what if they don't renew with the ACC? I'm like, there's no one in hell at ESPN. They would be immediately fired if they suggested to give up the ACC. Like, there's no way. There's too many good brands, but also on top of that, it's like you're literally giving them nothing for all of this extra content. And think about it. And if now you've got Bill Belichick in a few years, and we all know, and I think we all believe that Bill's probably going to leave within 3 years, but let's say he stays 6. That puts us at that 2030 mark, right? And let's just say he is competitive, right? Now you've got a Miami team that's competitive. As much as I hate to admit this, FSU will become competitive again. Okay.
They should.
They
They
should.
have.
Clemson's going to stay relatively competitive. UNC, like you've got 5 brands right now just off the rip that are going to stay competitive, right? And then you throw in maybe Notre Dame becomes a little bit more involved, right? Because I think they schedule 5 now. Maybe they schedule 6 in the next couple years. Okay, well now you've got brands associated with the ACC that make it a little bit better. I'm not saying the ACC is going to become the SEC, but what I am saying is you're going to devalue the SEC when it's not winning a championship every year like it was the last decade.
Well, there has to be some collective outrage at some point, right? Because when you talked about like the dominance of the SEC, we talked about this in the early half of the year. It's because of the way the rankings and the polls are played out. Like, why
Right.
is it that the top of the top 15, 7 of them are SEC schools. We know that's not true. Just from watching how the season went through, that's just simply not true. So if you have a
Absolutely.
little bit more distribution in terms of what that ranking system looks like, where if you had 4 ACC teams in the top 25 and 5 Big Ten teams and 4 SEC teams and, 2 Big 12 teams, whatever it is, at least there, that parity is more, it's better represented. So you have some bargaining chips to go to the table and say, well, look at who we produce. Look at how we're stacking up in competition. You have to worry about doing like the preseason bowl or anything like that to measure your conference's worth. Those are great matchups for money for attendance. But in terms of like where you finish out at the end of the year, that's so important because it becomes the self-serving, BS about how the SEC is so much better than everybody else. We know it was Bama. We know it was every now and then another team. If they beat Bama, all of a sudden, oh, they're the greatest team in the world. So
Yep.
like that's what we saw. They're going to try to spin that exact same narrative now in the Big Ten to say, well, this is where the champions play, and if you beat them, you have to be the best team that's around. No, there has to be. What you see now is any team can be beat on any given day. So give every team a little bit more respect in terms of how they line up across from their opponents. That's all it
So
is.
wrapping this up, you had alluded to at the first question I asked that this was basically them kicking the can down the road. What do you think then is the future of the ACC and the grant of rights? Do you think that FSU and Clemson enter an agreement? Because here's my thing: if Clemson and FSU try and settle with the ACC, and because I've been watching a ton of FSU coverage on this whole thing. At best, they reluctantly admit that they're probably going to have to stay in the ACC, but a lot of FSU fans are really adamant about leaving the leaving the ACC. What do you think the future is for the ACC and the grant of rights?
I think it's a bigger question because look, let's address the elephant in the room when it comes to FSU podcasts and the echo chamber that they have. It's insane
It is.
from talking to somebody that watches a few of the podcasts and stuff, and the things that comes out of their mouth, it's wild. Like you would think the earth is flat
Oh,
watching some of those podcasts or
yeah.
watching some of
It's
those things where ESPN's gonna drop the ACC and it's gonna crumble tomorrow. Like, yeah, I'm 6'8" and I play for the US national team in volleyball. Like, no, that's not how that works. And like, if you're still on the Mike Norvell train, that says a lot about what's going on right now. But with that aside, in terms of the ACC and its grant of rights, I think the way that, television and sports is being consumed is going to play a major factor in the next 5 to 10 years of what those deals look like eventually. Everyone's investing in streaming platforms. Obviously, Netflix is going to go after as much live sports as it can. That's why I was thinking docu-series would be fantastic if you wanted
yeah.
to go independent at some point in time. A streaming service is going to be chomping at the bit to spend a lot of money to buy the rights to air some exclusive college football program or a college sports program. If they had the opportunity to get an entire conference, they would jump at the chance. So, in terms of how that works, if the ACC, let's say best case scenario, as the ACC gets as competitive as you say, and there's like 5 marquee brands where it may not be quite the SEC, but it's like what people consider the Big Ten 2 years ago. Let's say
Right.
the ACC gets that big. There's nothing stopping Netflix or another, network of saying, we have a broader reach now than your American broadcast piece. We can broadcast to your entire network around the world. So now if your, fans are traveling across Europe or something like that and they can't watch the game, hey, they got a Netflix subscription. Boom, you're going to be able to watch this. Just like what the WWE deal looks like with Monday Night Raw.
Yeah, and
So,
you could even do that. You could even have like kind of like what the Big Ten has with Fox and CBS, where certain games are featured on one network or the other. You could do that from an international perspective. So you could say, hey, like in the US, these are these networks carry the games. But if you're abroad, you can stream it on Netflix or Apple TV or Hulu, whatever one you want it to be.
yep, and honestly, that's probably how this could go. That's how I think this would probably happen because ESPN, as big as the company is with Disney and all that, like there's only so much they can do. I I
Well,
mean,
that is a whole other, I mean, just a little inside baseball with that whole thing. Disney is hemorrhaging money because of ESPN. They actually tried to put ESPN up for sale
yep,
a little over a year ago, and no one wanted it. No one wanted it. And so yeah, that's why I'm saying when you get into this, when we get into this next batch of deals, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised if people look at this, especially ESPN execs, if they're smart, they'll look at this from a 30,000-foot point of view and they'll say, "Hey, it's better to have multiple conferences than to have less conferences." One, from a power struggle level, because if you can control more, now you're only divvying it up between you and your main opponent, which would be Fox, right? So that Fox would have the Big Ten, you would have the SEC. Well, that's not as good as if you had the ACC. Maybe you get a little Big 12 in there. You know what I mean? It's a lot easier when you have your fingers in a bunch of things, as they would say in finance. Diversify your portfolio, right? That's
yeah,
what you would want to do at ESPN. But then again, a lot of these companies, how are they going to be able to get this money? Because I mean, we're talking what was it, $1.5 billion to the ACC?
yeah.
That's a lot of money. That's a
It's a lot of
lot.
money for some weird ass football.
Yeah.
It's a lot of money for, was that a catch? Was that not a catch?
Yeah.
That's a lot of money for, was that targeting or was that not targeting? Yeah.
And I'm just, again, just shooting things, see if it sticks to the wall. Because I don't think, again, I think if FSU and Clemson had seen traction whatsoever and interest from the Big Ten or the SEC, I think you would see the rhetoric in the litigation and in the, especially the discovery portion, get revved up faster. They would push for it to go to litigation faster. I think you're seeing, and even when you see people in the Big Ten, maybe not the commissioner, but you see presidents or people who are well to do say, yeah, we have no interest in either of those teams, especially with the way they're going through it. I wonder now, what are the chances you think, maybe not so much Clemson, I would be more interested from a Florida State perspective of them going independent.
I don't think they don't have the brand cachet to go independent
You don't think
because
so?
no, because here's the thing about FSU. Like in a few ways, they're like Miami in the sense of
Hmm.
like they're known for football, they're known for baseball. That's really about it.
That's
And
true.
that football program, I would even with the national championship in 2013 and the 13-0 season they had last year, they're not really like known for it. Like it's kind of like they were the last BCS champion, but people kind of forget that. So I don't
Yeah,
think as a brand nationally, they're quite as big. Like yeah, the Kansas City Chiefs like use their music. Yeah, the Atlanta Braves use their music, and that's where like all that all the chops came from Florida State. But I just don't see that as like a nationwide lovable brand. Like people talk about Florida State, that's cool. Oh, they might be back. That's really great. It's a state school, but I, I'm thinking about where does the extra value come in being independent. Notre Dame is because
okay,
they were such a historical,
that's
historic
true.
team in terms of like being around since Newt Rockney, and you used to play Army for national championships, and Michigan, and the whole Catholic thing. Like I get why Notre Dame has stayed that way for the longest time. And granted, they're really only known for like football, but they have a good hockey team. They have a good lacrosse program. Their basketball team, like women's basketball, is kind of hit or miss every now and then. They have other things that like keep them going.
Mm,
Florida State, if football's not there, they're not around because as much as we love
that's true.
college baseball, that's not a moneymaker. That's not anything that
No.
like ESPN's got that locked down for the College World Series in Omaha every single year, but you don't really hear much about that.
Yeah, no one really
So
watches college baseball.
no, and like I don't when you see the cesspool that is the FSU um conspiracy theory online pieces. Like if you see that in a 24/7 network for sports, you're not really going to get much. You're going to get Gene Deckerhoff's classic calls of like all these games from the 90s and the 80s. And don't get me wrong, it's fun to watch like those old FSU teams. I think they're fantastic. We obviously like not you, but I prefer them over the Gators anyway. So if they were to go, I just don't see where you could fill that much time in a network. And I don't know where you have like they're going to run into the same issue scheduling as they would with somebody else. Like
Well,
who
here's
would
how I
pay for the money?
this is what I would more say. They would go independent and maybe getting a deal with maybe an Apple TV, a Hulu, maybe even spreading, maybe giving part of their their grant of rights to maybe an NBC to get a main network, and then partially to a, a streaming service. The only reason why I say that is just because when you watch their podcasts, when you read these articles, they're very certain that they're going to go to the SEC or the Big Ten. Like it's either or. And I'm just like, okay, well, I mean, if those two aren't viable, you're definitely not going to the Big 12 because that's a lateral move, if not a lower move, rung move. Where else do you go? The only other option would be to go independent. So I just wonder if and what I'm getting at is FSU, the whole FSU community is very adamant about leaving the ACC. You're not leaving the ACC unless you go independent, in my opinion. There's nowhere
They
else.
think
It's going to
strictly.
cost too much money. You're already buried, and who's going to take you? And the other thing is no one's going to want to lose more money than what they're getting, especially with this Supreme Court decision that's going to come down in April. You know what I mean? Like, we haven't even gotten to that. And that's going to be like all these things of like realignment and NIL and the transfer portal. Those are basically, I mean, we thought they were boulders going into a lake, but they're really pebbles and maybe a large rock. When this Supreme Court decision comes down and there's going to have to be actual revenue sharing between athletes and athletic departments, that's going to be a meteor hitting college athletics, because it's not just when people talk about this settlement, that's not just football, that's baseball, that's volleyball, that's soccer, that's every sport. And you couple that with Title IX, you're talking about spreading that pot very thin. No one's going to want to take less money.
Yep.
You
And
know what I
and
mean?
by the way, there's one boogeyman that I forgot to mention about the whole Florida State going independent thing that kind of also connects to Miami. The company that does those negotiations for Florida State right now, in terms of media, sponsorship, all of that, is a third party. They work with Legends, which is
Oh,
based out of Texas. So, in terms of Legends trying to shop that around, State Farm is kind of a sponsor of Florida State, but not really. And Florida State's kind of in the same trouble that Miami is in terms of trying to find a major corporate sponsor to back them. If
yeah.
they can't get a corporate sponsor past like Good Greek Moving and Storage, they're never going to find a network that's going to represent them. They don't have the right representation to do that. That's part of what Miami's problem is too, because this
Listen,
whole
I need
year,
Burger King to get their act together and sponsor us for the love
that's
of God. You're from that or Popeyes, one of the two. I'm like, get it
that would be
together.
RBI. Yeah, it's Miami-based Restaurant Brands International. They own Popeyes, Burger
Burger
King,
King.
Tim Hortons, Firehouse
Yeah.
Subs. They spend a lot of money, but the only problem with them is they're very inconsistent. Like they go through agencies like crazy. So in terms of a deal like that, you couldn't get them locked in for more than 2 years
Yeah.
tops.
Well,
But yeah, Legends.
enough of the inside baseball stuff when it comes to media. Speaking of the ACC, the conference this week dropped the 2025 football schedule. Depending how you see it, it can either be in our favor or set up. Where do you stand, Rudy, in all of it?
Personally, I hate it because I will be out of town for the Notre Dame game. I will be like possibly out of town for the UF game. So it's like, why even
Oof,
buy season tickets if I'm going to miss the two best home games of the year?
that is
Um,
true.
the thing about this schedule that's really funny is, everyone, when Kirby Smart at Georgia last year was complaining, saying the SEC makes us play on the road, all these places, they didn't leave the state of Georgia for like 8 games. Miami leaves the state of Florida approximately 3 times next year.
Yeah.
They go to Dallas, they go to Boston College, and they go to Blacksburg.
Oh, and
So,
Pitt.
oh yeah, sorry, they go to Pitt.
They go to Pitt.
So they go 4 times, maybe.
Yeah, 4 times. So there's Miami will play 8 home games and 4 on the road. The Canes don't leave Florida till November, which is what you were alluding to, which is
Yes.
wild. And we'll have a stacked road schedule to finish the season. So while we're not leaving till November, the sad part is the end of the season, we're on the road the entire time pretty much.
Yep.
Miami opens ACC play at Florida State, which is a little tricky on October 4th. And will be idle both the week before and the week after that game, which was really, really weird to me. There's a sketchy situation with those bye weeks that I'm kind of a little off on. What are your thoughts on those back-to-back bye weeks? Not literally back-to-back, but to me they're back-to-back.
It might as well be back to back. It's weird. If Florida State was any good, it'd be nice to have a bye week before them to really like prepare for that. Because look, I think Mario kind of broke on the bye week curse thing, but at the same time, it stinks to do that with Florida State in their current condition, and also to kind of like, you want to have those spaced out in case you can get like your players rested and all that. So having them 2 out of 3 weeks does nothing for you. it gives you some rest if you had someone with like a significant injury, but they're going to need more than 2 weeks anyway. So
I think the logic behind it probably was, again, I don't know how they're even fitted, but like if you're going to have 2 bye weeks after them, after Florida, after FSU, after your two major rivalry games, I mean, it makes sense. I don't think, I mean, if I'm talking, by the way, I'm trying to fit a square peg in a round hole at this point. I'm not saying it makes sense literally, but I'm saying if you want to say it makes sense, your two biggest rivals of the season, like looking at the schedule right now, yes, Notre Dame, but I would say the two other biggest marquee games will be FSU, even though they're terrible, and UF. You know what I mean?
yep.
So why not have a bye? So that would be my devil's advocate argument for it. The real question I want to ask, and I literally was joking. I think we talked about this during the season. I was like, yeah, don't expect, 10-0 or a 10-win season this next year. Can Miami go undefeated this year?
If they fix that defense, anything's possible. But that's what stopped Miami from going undefeated this year. Was
Right.
they needed a pulse defensively, and they could have gone undefeated. The schedule is a little bit more difficult, but you also have almost everybody. You have another explosive offense in the works. You have Carson Beck, who looks like he's ahead of schedule because people are always watching him at the basketball games. No brace on anymore, so he's going to be throwing in the spring. He may
Well,
not be
let me
practicing,
let
but
me let me temper everyone's because like I've heard this on a couple podcasts. They're
he's
like, oh, he's got the
bionic, Chris.
yeah. Okay, let me. This is from a personal experience. I can tell you because I had I had my shoulder redone by a sports doctor. It's actually very normal for the time frame that he's in. It's you really are only supposed to be in the sling for about 2 weeks, and then you're out of it, and you're immediately, especially if you're an athlete and you're young like he is, you're out of the sling within 2 weeks, and you should be immediately be in physical therapy, and you should be going through your range of motion. Maybe not strength yet, obviously. Maybe even he's about 6 weeks out almost, I think. But yeah, it's normal. I would still temper the expectations. I don't think he's going to be anywhere near ready for spring. I don't think he's going to be involved in spring. I think if we're lucky, we'll get him ready and somewhat involved in like early fall camp, and then as we gear up for the season, he'll be
He's not
involved.
dressing and practicing in the spring, but
Yeah,
he might be able to regrow a digit if he lost one at this point. He's so young in terms
yeah.
of what he's able to do. He's still got some of that baby DNA that he can regrow some limbs. But
So
in terms of that, like, yeah, they're all returning. Like you have some great productivity coming back. Is if that defense is anywhere near what Miami standard would be, that's a really good season that's coming up.
yeah. Well, how worried are you about the final two games being road games, but specifically up north in Blacksburg and Pittsburgh?
I'm not any more like concerned than I am with any of the games that we had last year because like Miami's built to play in those if they need to. It's a matter of just you need to play defense. And if they run the ball, they'll run the ball. They'll be fine. Like I think that's okay. I wouldn't say that the elements in those games, look, the good Miami teams played well in those elements anyway. They might have squeaked a couple out in the cold, but they still won those games. Like, Boston College, they will go up there at the end of the year and it would be a slugfest, but they found a way to win those. You have to win those games, especially now in this college football playoff environment where there's a likelihood that, let's say you don't win the ACC, you don't get that first round bye, you might be going on the road and playing in one of those cold environments. So if you can get out of the way early and play through it, that's a confidence booster.
Which, if any, games are you most concerned about looking at the schedule?
It's always the ones you don't expect to be tough games. Like I'm not going to say USF scares me on the schedule or something like that, but I would say one of those later games. I mean, Virginia Tech always plays Miami tough.
Right.
Going up there, we don't have the best history playing in Blacksburg. We should have won more games than we do up there. But then again, Virginia Tech is not what they used to be. Um, Pittsburgh, kind of the same story. They're not quite what they used to be, and that would be even the games that we were like scariest, we still kind of won up there. Like the Dion Lewis years, I thought, oh, we're in trouble, and we somehow made it through those. Like we only lost that one game in 2017, and honestly, Miami should have won that. So, I don't know. Like it's call me being a homer, but like nothing scares me until really the season comes. If you ask me
Right.
now, it's been released. I'm bring everybody. But if you ask me by like week 2, week 3 after Notre Dame to see what we know about the team after those first couple of games, then I'll tell you what scares us. I mean,
But you can't even go by that because even last year we looked great the first 6 games.
right, but you were still scared about Syracuse. Like there were still
Oh,
some
yeah,
games
well,
that were like,
that
ooh,
was
that could
something.
be a
Yeah,
problem.
I mean, I called Syracuse from week one. I was like, "Listen, guys, I'm like, I'm cord. I'm like this," and then especially the way Syracuse looked this first few weeks, I was like, "Do not sleep on them," and we
Yeah,
did.
yeah, and
So,
we gave them a 21-point lead, and yeah, it was insane. So like, I look at those and I don't see anything that's like really scary up front. I mean, yeah, Notre Dame's gonna be a tough game. It's front loaded, but they'll have a lot of stuff to lose and figure out again. They got a
I
new
mean, they're
quarterback in
losing talent too.
Michigan.
A lot of their key players are veteran players who are who aren't going to the draft or aren't seniors. They're actually transferring out. I think they just lost an O lineman to Michigan.
Yep.
They've lost some other players to some other Big Ten teams. So it's not like they're returning that national championship competing team. You know what I mean? So that actually gives me some hope for that. I think the one team I'm actually semi concerned with is SMU, just
Yeah.
because it's an away game. I think it's our first away game out of Florida, meaning, you know what I mean? It's not going to be Florida State. So I think that's my only kind of worry. And they were stellar last year. They're returning a lot of their key players that they have. Plus, they got TVD. They got
I mean,
TVD.
DVD's not playing.
I
he's
know, I know, I
he's
know.
not playing. But I mean, look,
Miami
if
West versus Miami East.
that'll tell you if Miami's defense has improved because that's an offensive system that would have absolutely annihilated Miami's existing defensive last year. If they've improved, I mean, we saw what a good defense, a stout defense would do against SMU, that when they play physical, when they lost to both BYU and Penn State, it showed. So that it gives me optimism, but at the same time, it's one of those where if we see what the defense looks like and it's not any better, yeah, it gets to be a little bit of a tougher road. The other thing I want to mention too is, Notre Dame also lost Al Golden, started driving his Subaru out of South Bend. Now he's in Cincinnati. So, you
He
know,
didn't want the smoke, bro. He did not want the smoke. He did not want to come down here and have to face us. All right,
nope.
Rudy, we have to do it. Way too early projections. What do you got? What's our record? You don't have to give me who we lose to or if we lose, but what's your projection?
Regular season 11-1.
11-1.
Oh, sorry, no, we played 12 games, right? Yeah, 11
Yeah,
and 1.
11-1. Oh, you have more faith than me. I'm going to say 10-2. I'm going to say 10 and 2
I'd
again.
be
I don't know
happy
which
with 10
ones
and
because
2.
something tells me like I'm going to bank on us. Like something tells me I have faith we're going to win the Notre Dame and the UF game, which should be technically our hardest games. So that would lead me to a natural undefeated. But I said the same thing last year, and I had a fear that we would lose to teams we shouldn't have lost to, and we did. So I just think Miami, sadly, we do that. It's a very Miami thing. It's like our version of Clemsoning. It's a Clemson's gonna Clemson, Miami's gonna Miami, and we do this shit, and I hate it. It just
Do do
aggravates me every
we
year.
do we make the championship game at 10 and 2?
See, that's the thing, man. Because the two losses could be Notre Dame and UF, or they could be SMU and Vatech, or even worse, it could be Vatech and Penn and Pitt. Because think
Yeah,
about it. The 2 seasons, think about it, in the last decade, the 2 seasons we've been dominant, when did we lose?
at the very end.
So it's like Miami's going to Miami. And I'm going to go into next season thinking we're going to be undefeated with the caveat knowing that we're probably going to lose 2 games. And they're not going to be the 2 games I think they're going to lose.
Yep.
you know?
Yep.
Well, a familiar face is crawling out of the depths of disgrace, and well, that isn't sitting well with some people, and one of those people being our very own Rudy Tamarchio. What do you got for us on this edition of Rudy's Rant?
Uh, you know, memory serves a lot of memory kind of like deceives a lot of people, right?
Yeah, we
Because
call it revisionist history.
yes, like people always like want to look back and think that somebody had a bigger impact that they did. And I wanted to do this for a while because when Nevin Shapiro, because that's who we're talking about today, when he first started coming back on social media and talk about Miami Hurricane stuff and saying I'm the original NIL and all this other stuff. Let's peel back the curtain real quick because I think people have forgotten about this story for the most part. The those of you who are going out and like watching these podcasts, just know that you might as well be watching Florida State podcasts because the amount of fact and the amount of truth that's being used are somewhere equal, except
Are
this
you
guy
referring
did
to
a
the
lot of content.
BTN, the BTN
I
podcast?
I don't know.
The one where
I
like
feel
they're like
like
kind of like in a purple magenta style room and they're all like on a couch. Not a
one was
couch,
on
but
a
chairs.
couch. There was another one. He was sitting like in a director's chair. Like he's been in a few places. I feel like he's kind of been like making the rounds
Yeah,
to
he's on
different
this
people.
one. Just so people know, the BTN one that he's been featured on, because I've watched, because I wanted to make sure when you were doing this rant that I could have a perspective and I wasn't going completely blind. But that actually is hosted by a FSU alum, so
Well,
you're
there you
not
go.
far off. You're not far off.
That should be enough to know right there. I mean, look, if as much as the Miami guys don't bring him on the show, I think they're doing that in good judgment because let's peel back the curtain a little bit. We were students when all of this was supposed to be happening. We were both working at WSVN Channel 7 News when the Yahoo Sports article dropped.
Dropped.
I was in the newsplex when
Yep.
that Yahoo Sports article dropped.
Yep.
The first person that shared that with me was either our boy Frank, Fireman Frank,
Mhm.
or it was, I think, one of the guys in sports. Because I think Shappy was like, brother, you went to Miami. What was this?
I remember vividly seeing it. So when we worked at Channel 7, in the program we used to write and stack all of our stories, you would get AP alerts.
Yep.
And the AP alert would come across once as red, and it would be just a quick byline, like a headline. And then you would get a yellow, and then the white would basically, there's three colors, and it would get thicker. The story would get thicker. I remember when that red one came across about the Yahoo Sports article, and I was just like, no.
iNews. That was our program.
I news.
Yeah.
Yep.
And when I started reading it, the first thing I did was go to like all of our producers, like Shaw, Gonzalez, went back to Shappy and DePasquale, and all of them was like, this is BS. Like, of all the allegations that are in there, none of this is true. So the name Nevin Shapiro, when I was Sebastian the Ibis and we'd do stuff like I would spend time a lot in the athletics department area, the Heck Athletic Center, the football wing. We would have like Monday meetings with our boss, who was Connie Nickel, who was like the third in charge of the athletic department. To kill time in between the classes and going to that meeting, I would hang out in this room that had a little plaque on it that was called the Nevin Shapiro Student Athlete Lounge. Never heard of that guy before. And when you walk in, it was literally like a room that had a bunch of repurposed furniture that used to be in the locker room. So, like, you know, that U shaped couch that they talk about in the documentaries, and they say, like, that's where all the fights used to happen. That couch was in the student athlete lounge. The big screen TV, the old ass, like, tube big
Yeah.
screen TV that you needed to, like, lose like 3 feet of depth from your wall and a piece of
And you
furniture to
and you
have
would
it
have
fit.
static electricity, have your hair stand up if you got too close to
Yes,
it.
yeah, you put your like hand up against it and literally like your hairs would just start standing on end. Yeah, one of those was in there. That was in the locker room at some point in time. There was some like random video game machine. Like there was nothing in there. And then by the way, like a year later, plaque was gone. What happened? Check didn't clear. So like when they talk about a guy who paid who was doing all of these things for these players, like I understand like where a story like this grabs legs in, in what Miami people like to call BFE or
Yeah.
like the flyover states, or in terms of like what nightclubs are. Do you really think that 21-year-old kids who are going to be first round NFL draft picks who are like, having to beat girls away with like literally like push them away with their hands and their entourages. Do you really think they needed a guy like Nevin Shapiro, who's like 5 foot something, like just sloppy looking dude to get them into nightclubs?
Right. Yeah. Well, I will say this. I did, because I had to cross reference. I did watch some of the podcasts. Specifically, I watched the whole Uncle Luke one.
Mhm.
And then I watched one with was it Philip? Phillips? I forgot. He was a
You talk
DB.
about Randy Phillips.
Randy Phillips. Yeah, the Randy Phillips episode. They vouched for him. They did say he had a sphere of influence in Miami, especially when it came to the clubs, and he would take the guys to the clubs. I will say though, in your defense, do I think he was this ringleader and was he this, this anchor in terms of everyone being surrounded by him? No. I think there were a few players that saw that he was a very beneficial person to be around for a social life and for other things, and they latched on to him.
This is what it is. It's a few players that used to play pool at his house, and maybe they'll get bottle service one night. But like that's literally the extent of it. Because when you look at like if you go to the sidelines, I was on the sidelines every single game. That guy was never there. The same clip they kept showing over and over again of him running through the tunnel was from like 2002. They
Right.
did that every game. They had a different family come over and like they do the Papa John's game ball delivery, and they'd have like the family or the kid deliver the game ball out, or they run through with the team. Like they thought he was what, Michael Irvin on the sidelines this year? No, he didn't do any of that. So in
Right.
terms of like being around that program, like when you talk about a sphere of influence, remember his underling that was supposed to be in the athletic department, Pee Wee, who was in the equipment room, like you're talking about a teenager, a kid. That's
Yeah.
your sphere of influence. So the same scam that he pushed that ended up doing federal time for is exactly the same kind of like overblown sphere that he says he did with Miami. Uncle Luke was more of the influential Miami figure on the sidelines than Nevin Shapiro ever was. And remember when that originally first came out, even Luther Campbell was saying this guy couldn't hold a candle to what my influence was there.
Oh yeah.
So it's the whole thing is a joke. And to come back now and to say like to give people like this a platform to make it sound like they were who they were. No, look, let's use a more modern example. Let's go look at really let's go talk about this whole stadium that's happening and that's supposed to be
John
happening in
Ruiz.
Tropical Park with John Ruiz. That's never going to happen. Like
My
there's so many
man.
things.
Devin
This was
Shapiro 2.0.
well at 3.0. Well, yeah, 1.0 at this point, but like in the sense of they needed the stadium more than Miami did. And it was never going to happen in the sense of all the studies have been done. Like people don't want to do any little research and look back and say, well, what happened? Oh, well, Miami needs a stadium. Miami never had a stadium. The Orange Bowl was never owned by the University of Miami. That was City of Miami property. Miami paid rent. Miami's always been paying rent.
Right.
Miami is the only program to dominate college football while paying rent and not having a mortgage. Well, the USC, because they're I don't well, I think they now own the Coliseum, but at one point I don't think they did. Either way, the whole point of this rant was let's stop giving people who act like big shots a larger platform to spew more BS because at the end of the day wasn't really a fly on the horse's ass of Miami football in the beginning of the downfall.
Right. I agree with you. I think the other thing, an important thing to remember is let's just even play devil's advocate and say he was a power player and he got kids to come to UM and he facilitated kids to stay at UM. He did that by robbing families and stealing money from people.
Yeah.
That's what you have to remember. And, we joke in Miami about how, like, hey, like, I don't care if the NIL money's coming from cocaine dealers in Colombia or whether it's actual businesses. But at the end of the day, like, Nevin Shapiro was found guilty of stealing money, hundreds of millions of dollars from people to facilitate his own lifestyle, but to also, facilitate this hobby that he had. I definitely think it's a little strange. I will give him this in the podcast I watched, he definitely seems a little remorseful. I think he definitely recognizes, this is where he kind of messed up. But I also am like, hey, listen, bro, you screwed up. And not only did you screw up, but you tried taking the ship down. And like that to me, that's the most egregious thing is it's like, I don't mind if you're going to go down, but go down by yourself. Like, don't try and take down our program with you and then put
Well,
us in probation and then literally put us basically in the dark ages. You know what I mean? Not that we like it's not like Al Golden was really going to help us, but it's also like we kind of like swindled Al Golden to be our coach at that time because it's not even like Al Golden understood what he was getting himself into. And I think he was kind of handcuffed as well, not making excuses for Al Golden. But again, it's one of those kind of like, the shitstorm aligning. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, well, I mean, and put it this way too, like that all goes back to what the personality trait of the con artist is. It's that like he was doing this for his own personal gain and saying that he was this like influential person, but then as soon as things went aside and Miami didn't come to his defense of some sort, he's like, "Well, I'm just going to make up a bunch of things and try to get you guys in as much trouble as possible." That's why you go back into saying like you're giving this guy a platform again to tell these stories. Look, if this was approached differently, if it was just a yeah, we did some crazy things. We had some fun stories and it was all laughs. That's great. But like to reinflate the ego, to
oh
try
yeah,
to, revive like we talked about revisionist history to say that you were doing something that you were. Yeah, it was the second largest Ponzi scheme in American history at that point in time, right after our boy Bernie Madoff. And because Miami does everything better than Florida. The Miami booster with the Ponzi scheme robbed more money than the Florida booster from the Ponzi scheme because everyone forgets about good old Scott Rothstein,
Oh yeah.
who was a huge bull gator booster for the University of Florida around the exact same time as Nevin Shapiro. So yeah, I just that's where it kind of hurts me in the sense of like as much as you want to talk about like, hey, well, stick up for your program. It was never Nevin Shapiro's program. He never went to
Right.
school, never cared for it. It was
Nope.
just I live in Miami because I want to flash. This is the hot ticket in town, so I want to go flash my money over here and make myself look like a big deal. If it wasn't Miami, it would have been Florida State, would have been Florida, would have been you name it, another he would have done this somewhere else. He could have done it at FIU for all we care.
Oh, absolutely.
So
100%.
yeah, this is the kind of stuff that gets why it sucks that Miami has that reputation of having like these very very quick buck con men because all of the old money are guys like T Boone Pickens who go to the Big 12 or the guys or what's his name from oh my god, what's that billionaire's name that donates to Ohio State that has all the that has that big company
LeBron
like
James. No, I'm just kidding.
no, it's not LeBron. It's the dude that would pay LeBron's salary in the NBA. I'm trying to remember what his name is, but he's one of these. He's like the heir to one of these huge, huge companies, and he's the main donor behind all of Ohio State's like NIL.
Well, I mean, listen, Oregon has Nike. We have Ponzi schemers and cocaine dealers. That's there's nothing more Miami than that. Rudy, I hope you feel good with that little rant. We have another one in the books. Thank you all for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Let us know what you think about whether it's the DC, the ACC schedule, the ACC signing with ESPN or ESPN extending, or what do you think about Rudy's rant with Nevin Shapiro? Let us know. Drop a word in the comments. Until next week, be good, y'all. Win the weekend. And as always, go Canes.
His name was Les Wexner. That's the
Lex
Ohio State
Western.
donor.
No idea who that is, but I don't care about anyone from Ohio. So,
Hundreds of millions of dollars, and probably all
hun
20 of the NIL
for the millions and
and
millions of
millions
dollars.
of NIL dollars.
Love you, Rudy. We'll see you guys next week.
Have a good night.